Southern Gothic is a distinctive form of Gothic literature rooted in the American South. We focus here on two critics, Thomas Bjerre in his Southern Gothic Literature from the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Literature, and two chapters from the Palgrave Handbook of the Southern Gothic, edited by Susan Castillo Street and Charles Cropp. These critics will help us define the Southern Gothic, explain its historical context, and highlight its central features. Southern Gothic adapts the Gothic tradition but localizes it in the South. Instead of castles and ghosts, we find ruined plantations, grotesque characters, and haunted communities burdened by history. The movement flourished between the 1920s and 1950s, when writers used the Gothic mode to expose the social, racial, and psychological tensions of the South. We will see here how the Southern Gothic was not escapist fantasy, but a way of telling unsettling truths about Southern life. John Macready's Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, shown here, evokes the haunting blend of history and spirituality central to the Southern Gothic. Throughout the presentation, we'll also use photographs and artworks from ruined plantations to Flannery O'Connor's farm that visually capture the critic's insights into the grotesque, the haunted house, and the persistence of history. Bjerre defines Southern Gothic as a regional transformation of the Gothic tradition. While European Gothic gave us castles, ghosts, and supernatural horrors, the Southern Gothic gives us ruined plantations, haunted landscapes, and grotesque characters. It blends realism with Gothic unease, grounding horror in everyday social and historical conditions. The grotesque is central. Characters may be deformed, unstable, or socially marginalized, serving as symbols of a community's anxiety. Settings are haunted, not by literal ghosts, but by the past, slavery, the Civil War, poverty, and racial violence. Bjerre emphasizes that this makes the Southern Gothic less about supernatural terror and more about social critique. By focusing on alienation, violence, and repression, it exposes the South's unresolved traumas. In short, Southern Gothic takes Gothic devices and uses them to portray the real horrors of Southern history and society. This image of the Winster ruins in Mississippi virtually embodies Bjerre's definition: Gothic unease rooted not in castles, but in the ruined plantations and haunted spaces of the South. Bjerre situates Southern Gothic in the history of the South after the Civil War. The region was haunted by the legacy of slavery and the defeat of the Confederacy, which left behind poverty, bitterness, and unresolved racial tensions. The Great Depression in the 1930s deepened the sense of despair and decay. At the same time, myths of the Old South, with its imagined gentility and plantation grandeur, circulated in popular culture, standing in stark contrast to the harsh realities of segregation, violence, and poverty. Southern Gothic literature takes aim at this contradiction, presenting communities that are fractured, decaying, and haunted by their past. It critiques the nostalgia for the Old South by showing its ruin, both physical and moral. William Faulkner's novels, such as Absalom, epitomize this haunting of the present by the past, transforming Southern history into Gothic narrative. Walker Evans' Tenant Farmer's Wife, shown here, illustrates the poverty and despair Bjerre highlights, showing how the Depression deepened the South's sense of ruin and alienation. Street and Crow emphasize the grotesque as the hallmark of Southern Gothic. The grotesque refers to characters or situations that are abnormal, unsettling, or exaggerated. These may be figures who are basically deformed, mentally unstable, or socially marginalized. Far from being mere spectacle, the grotesque reveals the violence of social norms. What a society rejects as abnormal often reflects its own deepest fears and hypocrisies. Carson McCullers, for example, describes hair work as intense realism, meaning that the grotesque is not an escape from reality, but an extreme form of it. In hair writing, the abnormal becomes the norm, and through these so-called freaks, Southern Gothic exposes the cruelty of communities that demand conformity. By foreshadowing grotesque outsiders, the genre shows how the South defines itself by excluding difference, and it turns those exclusions into a source of Gothic unease. This exaggerated painting for Thomas Hart Benton, Prologue, suggests that the grotesque realism that Street and Crow emphasize is seen clearly. These outsized, unsettling forms reveal these social anxieties. Bjerre stresses the importance of setting in Southern Gothic. Landscapes are not just background, they act almost like characters themselves. We see ruined plantations, decaying houses, and abandoned buildings that serve as physical reminders of the past. The landscape is haunted not by ghosts, but by history, slavery, defeat, violence that continue to intrude on the present. Poverty and isolation contribute to the eerie atmosphere. Fields gone to waste, towns that feel cut off, homes falling apart. These places embody trauma and repression, the things a community does not want to acknowledge. In the Southern Gothic, the environment reflects psychological and social unease. For example, Faulkner's well-known story, A Rose for Emily, is a classic example of this theme. The decaying Grierson's house functions as a haunted place, mirroring the community's refusal to let go of its past. Lauchlan's photograph shown here from Ghosts Along the Mississippi captures abandoned southern houses overtaken by decay, echoing this point about landscape being haunted by history. Street and Crow show how Southern Gothic is preoccupied with outsiders. These figures may be women resisting traditional gender roles, black characters confronting racism, queer individuals, or poor whites. What they have in common is alienation. Society treats them as abnormal, grotesque, or dangerous. But by focusing on them, Southern Gothic exposes the hypocrisies of supposedly respectable communities. A small town might seem orderly and decent, but beneath the surface lie cruelty, repression, and violence. Outsiders hold up a mirror to society, showing that what it fears or rejects is actually part of itself. The Gothic unease comes not from supernatural monsters, but from the community's treatment of difference. By dramatizing alienation and exclusion, the genre critiques Southern society, revealing the cost of maintaining its myths of tradition and purity. Ralph Eugene Meatyard's eerie doll and mask photograph shown here embodies the uncanny presence of outsiders that Street and Co describe, exposing the strangeness beneath ordinary Southern life. Street and Co highlight the role of women writers in the Southern Gothic. These include Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, and Carson McCullers. These writers used Gothic motifs to explore the repression of women in the South. Domestic spaces, the home, the kitchen, the parlor, become uncanny, sites of fear and unease. Female characters often confront silence, tradition, or expectations that confine them. Through Gothic exaggeration, the genre exposes how gender roles themselves can be grotesque, unnatural, damaging, and enforced through repression. Welty, though wary of the Gothic label, nevertheless transformed ordinary Southern domesticity into something uncanny, exposing how tradition and social expectations could themselves be sources of Gothic unease. By unsettling ordinary spaces and everyday lives, these writers turned the familiar into the uncanny. This photograph of the writer Flannery O'Connor at her Andalusia farm with her peacocks embodies the Southern Gothic's gendered critique. Women writers turned domestic Southern settings into uncanny scenes that reveal repression as grotesque. Both Bjerre and Street stress that Southern Gothic must be distinguished from traditional Gothic. Instead of castles, we see these ruined plantations. Instead of ghosts, we encounter grotesque outsiders. Horror in Southern Gothic does not come from the supernatural, but from social reality, racism, poverty, repression, and violence. Yet the movement remains Gothic because it disturbs and unsettles, turning the ordinary into the uncanny. Freud's idea of the uncanny, the familiar made into strange, applies here. The everyday South, with its towns, homes, and traditions, becomes Gothic when it is revealed as haunted by history and marked by cruelty. Southern Gothic blends realism with Gothic tropes, creating what Bjerre calls an uncanny South. This mixture shows us that the South is not only haunted by ghosts, but by its own unresolved past, which refuses to stay buried and continues to shape the present. This illustration for Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven contrasts with the Southern Gothic. Traditional Gothic castles and spectres give way to plantations, grotesque figures, and haunted landscapes. In conclusion, Southern Gothic is defined by its blend of realism and Gothic unease. It portrays communities haunted by history, race, poverty, and repression. Its central features include grotesque characters, alienated outsiders, and uncanny landscapes that turn the familiar into something disturbing. Bjerre defines the form as a regional transformation of Gothic, rooted in the history and trauma of the South. Street and Crow emphasize its focus on the grotesque, its feminist critiques, and its exposure of social hypocrisy. These critics show us that Southern Gothic is not escapist horror, but social critique, revealing the violence and contradictions beneath myths of Southern tradition. The genre unsettles readers, not with ghosts or castles, but with the reality of a haunted region where the past is never past and the ordinary is always tinged with unease. Writers such as Faulkner, Welty, O'Connor, and McCullers, shown here, all used the Gothic to critique Southern life, each shaping the genre in distinctive ways.